Joel didn't wake me up this morning. That's when I knew something was wrong. The back room was the same temperature as always. Cold, that particular cold that lives in buildings without heat, that settles into walls and floors overnight and doesn't respond to blankets or breath. I lay still for a moment with my eyes open and listened. No movement, no footsteps, no low voices from the main room, nothing. I already knew before I stood up. Something in the quality of the silence told me, the same instinct that had been sharpening itself for 15 days into something I barely recognized as instinct anymore. The building felt different when it held only one person. I'd lived that difference for 8 days before Joel and Ellie arrived. I recognized its shape immediately. Their gear was gone. Joel's pack, the worn gray one that sat in the corner every night within arm's reach, gone. Ellie's bag, smaller dark blue, the fraying strap she'd never fixed, gone. The section of wall where Joel had arranged their supplies in the ordered, methodical way of someone who needed to know exactly where everything was at any moment. Bare, the camp stove was still there. Half the remaining food supply, the spare batteries, arranged in 2 rows on the kitchen counter, left for me, deliberately separated from what they took. I stood in the center of the main room for a long time. The chair at the table had been moved, not pulled out, angled, turned slightly toward the window, the way you'd angle it to sit and look outside. It was positioned near something on the table's surface, an object I hadn't seen before, Ellie's pen, the one she carried in her jacket pocket, the one that had been in her hand almost every time I'd looked at her over the past 6 days. Not forgotten, it was placed. Centered on the table in front of the angled chair, the way you place something you meant to leave. I picked it up and held it and didn't write anything for a long time. I understand the logic of it. That's the part I keep returning to, the part I've been turning over all morning. Joel was a man who made decisions based on survival mathematics, and the survival mathematics of the situation were clear, and had been clear for several days. An unknown variable in a closed group is manageable until it isn't. The point at which it becomes unmanageable is not always visible until after it's passed. Joel was a man who had learned from wherever he'd been before, from whatever he'd survived before arriving at my door, that waiting for that point to arrive was the last mistake some people got to make. He didn't wait. He made the call. He packed quietly in the early hours when I was deepest in sleep, and he took Ellie, and he went south, the way he'd been telling me to go. The rational direction, the lower saturation, the better odds. He did the reasonable thing. It still moves through me like something cold and permanent. I remember a moment from day 11, after I'd come back inside from the street, the walk I didn't remember taking, the 8 shapes moving north with me in formation. After Joel told me what had happened, Ellie had been sitting on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself, not looking at me, and at some point when Joel stepped away, she'd looked up. She hadn't said anything, just looked. The specific look of someone deciding whether to say the true thing or the manageable thing. She'd chosen silence. I understood now that she'd been trying to find a version of it that could be said out loud without breaking something. She hadn't found one. She'd left a pen instead. I sat in the angled chair and looked out the window for a while. The fog, the street, the 7 shapes across the road and their configuration. Still there, of course, still there. They were always there, patient, in the way that something is patient when time doesn't wear on it the same way it wears on people. The northern cluster of 3, the southern pair, the single one opposite the entrance, the one at the corner of the cross street. None of them moved. They were waiting for whatever they were always waiting for. I looked at the pen in my hand. Then I opened the notebook and wrote the date and put the pen down and looked back at the window again. I went outside at noon, not for observation, not for information gathering, not for any reason that I could have written down in the supply column of my notes. I went outside because the apartment had become the silence of one person in a space that had held 3, and that specific silence was harder to be inside than the fog. The moment I stepped onto the sidewalk, they moved, not toward me, not the angular, deliberate approach I'd seen in the early days. They shifted, a coordinated adjustment, the whole arrangement rotating slightly around my position the way a compass needle finds north, orienting, settling, including me in the geometry. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the street and the fog and the 7 shapes that had been watching this building since before Joel and Ellie arrived, and I thought about what the city used to be, not before the collapse, further back, before I moved here. The version of this street in some other year, when the buildings had light in them and the noise of 2 million people was just the background frequency of existing in a place. I tried to hold that image. It was harder to access than it had been yesterday. Not gone, just further, like trying to see something in peripheral vision that disappears when you look directly at it. One of the shapes across the street tilted its head. I realized I'd been standing with my own head tilted at the same angle. I straightened. It straightened. Joel's reasoning was correct. He was protecting Ellie, not from cruelty, not from selfishness, not from the particular ruthlessness that fear sometimes produces in people who don't examine it closely enough. He was protecting her from a risk that had become too specific to ignore, and he did it cleanly, without confrontation, without the damage that a confrontation would have left in both directions. He gave me the supplies. He left me the stove. He left me enough to function. He made the separation as survivable as he could. That's what the best version of the decision looks like. I understand it completely. What I couldn't have told him, what I couldn't have told myself, even this morning, is that understanding it completely is also a change. There's a version of me, a day one version, a version that ran a freelance life in a city full of people and knew his neighbors by sight and stopped at the corner store on Saturday mornings. Who would have felt this as pure loss? Who would have sat in the chair and held a borrowed pen and had nowhere to process it except grief? That version would have been unable to step outside in the fog and stand among 7 shapes that tilted their heads when he tilted his and feel, beneath the grief, something that was the opposite of alone. I feel the grief. It's real, and it's significant, and I'm not writing it out of this log because it doesn't fit. But underneath it, barely audible and getting less barely, they're still here. They've always been here, and the fog doesn't feel empty when I'm in it. I stood outside for 40 minutes. The 7 shapes stayed in their positions. When I turned to go back inside, they all shifted slightly, the specific adjustment of a group maintaining sight lines on a moving figure, keeping me in frame. Joel didn't say goodbye. I've been trying to decide what that means. I think it means he already knew. I wasn't the person he met anymore, and I think I'm writing this slowly, making sure I want it on the page. I think he might have been right.